Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Chapter 14. Excerpted from the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered that sleepy region, they are sure, in a little time, to inhale the witching influence of the air, and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams, and to see apparitions. October 30th, early evening, just after sunset. It was an easy thing to pour herself back into research and the reassuringly predictable motions of academic rigor for the remainder of the day. She cataloged artifacts, sent faxes from the library, emailed questions to colleagues, forwarded a draft of her paper to her editor, and FedExed several boxes of artifacts to her university's archives. She'd found a pewter spoon, some broken spectacles, 2 cartridge box buckles, one from a light infantryman in His Majesty's 43rd Regiment of Foot, and one from New York's 2nd Continental Regiment. The socket of a French bayonet, the firelock from a pistol, a hatchet head, a penknife, 2 ring bolts, and the remnants of at least 4 clay pots. Not to mention all the terribly corroded iron spikes. All of these she forwarded ahead as evidence that this area of the river, near the blackened oak tree where the river was black and deep, had seen considerable traffic and could be considered a favorable candidate for the Colonial Bridge's forgotten location. It was almost too much. It would positively floor her department head, and she knew that tenure was finally within reach. She could smell it like an expectant feast sprawled over a table, in a room whose doors had just opened for her to peek in. A feast that was steaming and fatty. She forwarded the articles as soon as they were catalogued, photographed, and described, but not the horseshoe. The horseshoe she kept. Inexplicably, she felt that there was no need to part with it yet. It stayed in her apartment where she could see it, and it made her feel somehow guarded, or watched. That night she had no trouble falling asleep. She left the transom open and the delicious coolness of a late October evening trickled into the apartment and drew the feverish heat out of her brain as she drifted off. Tossing between nods, she saw a series of images flitting behind her half-shut eyes. She saw herself as a child, peering over the railing of the Route 9 bridge, while her father rested a protective hand on her shoulder. She saw him turn around slowly and walk down the road towards the cemetery. Now the scenery was changing around him, and he was in the woods at daybreak. He was now emerging from the trees onto a knoll overlooking a lake, warming in the sun's red light. Now he was sitting down at a bench to watch the black water transform into a gleaming sheet of blood, just before filling his mouth with a pistol barrel and tearing out the back of his head. The scenes changed more rapidly now. She was in a hospital room where her mother was hearing the news. Her gray, loose skin suddenly lost what color it had, as she clapped her bony hands around her mouth and her eyes bulged helplessly out of her cadaverous face. What change was happening now? The already dry and stringy hair was falling out in tufts, and the flaky skin seemed to be dehydrating, stretching tightly over her skull before turning an awful, awful white, then green, then a strange purple. Here, it began to bloat and blacken, then tear away from the bones, melting along with her milky eyeballs into a brown, lonely skeleton. And now she saw the uncomfortable glare of her little husband as he watched her from behind his horn-rimmed glasses and nervously twisted his fingers into his dark beard from the safety of a second-story window. She felt that she must speak her mind to him, but as she shouted, she realized that his beady eyes and fidgety fingers were suddenly morphing and growing as shadows began to lengthen around him. In the deepening darkness, she saw his form stretch out into a tall, thin figure with a small, round head, topped with wispy red hair and sporting an unnaturally wide, toothy grin. She couldn't see his eyes in the darkness, but the moonlight outside gleamed on those teeth. She thought of how they seemed large and sharp. And now something seemed stirring inside of his black clothes, a struggling, rustling movement under his jacket. Convulsions started jerking his shoulders back and forth, and as the smile widened, he reached up with two large white hands, strangely blistered and marbled with rot, and peeled away the folds of his coat as a flock of greasy black birds thrashed their way out and darted for her eyes. This last dream shocked her out of her sleep, and she sat bolt upright in bed, scanning the suite for anything that could reach out for her with long bony fingers. There was nothing to be seen in the dark red light floating in through the transom. She settled back down and looked up at the ceiling. Nothing. A meaningless cheese dream. The professor of early American studies sighed in justified relief. It was exactly what it seemed to be. Things were always, ultimately, inevitably, predictably, exactly what they seemed to be. Turning over in bed, she caught her breath and stifled a scream when she realized that she was facing the bare back of a man. Panic flooded her body as she tried to avoid giving herself away, but found her shallow breaths shuddering loudly through her clenched teeth as horrified tears welled in her eyes. He was not thin or fat, but had wide shoulders, and his ribs were padded in muscular flesh. Strength and wariness equally vibrated from him, and she seemed to know that he was very tired and that his face must be clenched in a heavy, troubled sleep. As she began to adjust the reality of what she was experiencing, she was suddenly aware of his smell, a warm, masculine blend of campfire smoke, worn leather, and pine needles. She saw one white ear protrude from the side of his head, while his curly, coal-black hair glinted in the faint light. Who was this stranger sleeping so naturally beside her? And what did his face look like? As she began to collect her thoughts, the building curiosity grew stronger than fear. She wanted to soak up and share his nightmares, to suck the poison from his restless body. She shifted forward without thinking and reached out to press herself into his back, to rest her hand on his clenched shoulder, to peer over into his face, which was turned away from her. She reached out and pulled herself up. She looked on his face before her hand reached his shoulder. She immediately knew that she shouldn't have looked, for his shoulder was cold and mushy, and when she leaned over to gaze on his sleeping face, there was nothing to see. The head had been entirely eaten away. There was nothing, just a raw, rancid stump. The pillow where the head should have been, where it had been seconds earlier, was soaked through in rotten, black blood. Panicking, she looked around and saw that her sheets around her were also stiff and sticky with coagulated gore that now clung to her like tar. She shrieked herself awake and groaned to find her shirt and sheets steaming with sweat. The gray-blue light of the early morning was coming in through the open window and glinting coldly on the horseshoe she had apparently left on her bedside table. Chapter 15. Excerpted from a letter of Washington Irving to Sir Walter Scott, 8th November, 1817. I am indebted to you for introducing me to that worthy white Lockie Longlegs, whose appearance I shall never forget striding along the profile of a knoll in his red nightcap, with his flimsy garments fluttering about him. His very uncouth appearance called to mind, most identically, the figure of a phantom from my own bygone days. As a mere stripling, an itinerant pedagogue who sojourned in one of those long-established Dutch communities on the banks of the Hudson. He was something of a rogue, with a capacious appetite for ambition, and although he forged his way into the affections of the old dames, he was no small relief to the venerable town fathers when he vanished, without hardly a trace one night, after an all-too disheartening interview with a country coquette. A shrewd and formidable creature who had charmed her way into his fertile imagination. It is true that some of the Dutch wives ventured to suggest that he had been spirited away to the infernal regions by the local tribe of goblins, and there are still loitering plowboys to this day who rush home to their mother's petticoats, flying like a wild shot, babbling with tales of having seen his melancholy spirit striding along a hillock in a high gale, the skirts of his great jacket flaunting about his lithe frame, so that it gave the appearance of a scarecrow, absconded from its garden watch. The venerable Master Longlegs looked the very picture of this same dreamy interloper, and I must regale you with this entire tragical history. I want breath and time to discuss it as truly deserves, and find that I am far too eager to get on with the rest of my budget of news. It is a tale which I mean to one day tell in the full scope and style which it so richly deserves. Chapter 16. Halloween Morning, just after daybreak. Whatever delusions the night had brought melted away with the rising sun. All these had been mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness. In the rosy light, streaming through the transom, she found no reason to be apprehensive. She awoke to a fine autumnal day, under a sparkling blue sky, aromatic with the bright musky fragrance of fall. It was her last full day in New York, and she had made the uncharacteristic decision to put her research aside for the entire morning and spend it exploring the local festivities. And perhaps she would do the same when evening came. Indeed, she decided to go to a reading of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow at the Old Dutch Church, followed by an appearance of the Headless Horseman and a public gala at the high school. She left her apartment at 9 that morning and made her way down the shady avenue, dappled in the morning sun coming through the scarlet maples. The air was clean and cold, and she had dressed for the weather by putting on a deep purple shift and a snow-white cardigan. Throughout the day, she visited the local antique shops, bookstores, and boutiques, meeting the shop owners and making cheery small talk with the customers. She savored 2 cups of coffee and read parts of a novel at the Muddy Water Cafe, bought a necklace and a framed lithograph at the Pretty Funny Vintage Antique Shop in Tarrytown, and enjoyed a leisurely lunch at Horse Feathers. This restaurant is just south of Patriots Park, and before she returned to her room to drop off her shopping bags, she meandered along Andre Brook as it wound its way through the dells under the stone bridges. Somewhere near this very spot was the site where the rough logs crossed the brook while the park was still Wiley's swamp, forever lost to time due to the lack of stone and iron in the construction. She hadn't even considered investigating its location, but there, on the edge of Andre Brook, between 2 of the arched bridges, as she stared into the drifting dark water, she felt that it could have been at no other place. With her eyes closed, she could sense how the slopes on either side of her must have been choked with thickets and brambles, how the sky must have been blotted away by swaying maples and tulip trees, and how 4 lengths of pine trunks, split down the middle and laid cut side up, must have been laid across the brook, here at this narrow, shallow area. She could see how 4 crude posts made of beech limbs must have been hammered into the ground on either side of the split logs to hold them in place, and how the wood must have been heavily dented and gashed by hooves. She could feel the clammy air rising from the black waters, and could hear the buzzing rattle of cicadas in the trees overhead, the murmur of crickets in the briar patches, and the belching of frogs in the cattails. Overhead she could see a handful of stars winking from the deep purple sky, while a golden crescent moon disappeared behind a bank of black clouds. She could see how there to the left, by the side of the creek where the slope rose and overlooked the bridge, a rider could wait for his victim to approach it. This was the same spot where Major Andre's captors had been idling when he rode up to them as he crossed the bridge. A spot forever connected to the mournful story of his decapitated career, his sham trial, and his pathetic execution. It would be a spot that locals both feared and respected because it represented their ability to repel invaders. A spot haunted by the memories of crime and war and revenge. The lurking rider would be gathered in the gloom of the thickets, but still visible enough to strike terror into the traveler's soul before rushing forward to pounce. But now her perspective was suddenly moved to the side. It was watching the bridge from the very spot in the thickets. Something caught her eye in the trees down the road. A dull orange light that bobbed slowly behind the trees. In a moment she realized that it was a lamp of some kind coming down the road. And within a few seconds she saw a horseman emerge from the trees and stop at the foot of the bridge. The crickets and cicadas continued to whir from their hiding spots, and the quiet trickle of the brook over small boulders was muffled by the sea of cattails and brambles on either side of it. She looked closer at the horseman's saddle, where the light was emanating. It was coming from an antique-looking lantern hanging from the pommel. His figure was bent and wiry. He was too tall for his saddle and too impatient for his impulsive, gnarled horse, and he hunched over the horse's neck, peering into the dark. He wore a red stocking cap almost to the bridge of his nose, and a clenched whip in his right hand like a sword. The lamp threw a ghastly orange light over his furrowed face. It was framed by red hair and sideburns, and she saw that the unwholesome skin was rotten with ulcers. His glassy eyes bulged in shock on either side of a large bent nose, and the thin lips peeled back to reveal 2 rows of long, yellowed teeth. Before the nocturnal atmosphere was shattered by his screams, she opened her eyes and saw a manicured park watered by a sleepy brook and clamoring with the happy shouts of schoolchildren. The night sky above was no longer crowded out by the trees and dark tentacles of cloud. It was blue and expansive. Suddenly she was aware of a strangely sweet odor like musk and the faint scent of lavender. She frowned and continued on her way. Just as she was crossing Pearson Avenue onto Bellwood Avenue, she caught a familiar face as it left the Phillipsburg Manor Museum. It was the mousy old curator, with her wide eyes magnified all the more by her enormous glasses. She was dressed in a period costume and humming "The Black Nag" to herself as she walked. When she caught a glance of the professor of early American studies, she dropped the tune and her face noticeably blanched. The professor of early American studies, who was not currently in the frame of mind of a professor of early American studies, smiled and changed her direction. "Hi, Mrs. Van Brunt. It's good to see you. Are you acting in the play tonight?" Mrs. Van Brunt was surprised by her tone and appearance. Suddenly, seemed to forget the fears that she had been harboring for the young academic. Maybe she had been mistaken after all. She seemed so much more friendly and sociable. "Hello, dear. Yes, all the museum staff are on call for the play tonight. I'm just taking tickets, though. I'm not much of an actress." "I was planning to see it when I get back from my hike later today. What time does it start again?" "You're hiking? Where at?" "I was just going to Douglas Park one last time. I said hiking, but it's really just a stroll. Across the cemetery. I thought I'd take in all the atmosphere before tomorrow." "That's when you leave? Tomorrow?" "Yeah. In the morning. 9 sharp. And you'll be going straight to the airport, I hope." "Absolutely. What time are you going on this walk?" Once again, the professor of early American studies began to chafe under the rapid-fire questions and started to regret this newfound sociability. Just in a couple of hours.
3 o'clock or so, early enough. Early enough. That's good. Just be careful not to stay there too long. Not when it's getting dark.
Here, her face visibly shuddered, and then a flash of hope brightened her huge eyes, and her mouth broke into a smile.
The play starts at 6, you see, and I'd so hate for you to miss it.
The professor of early American studies looked somewhat incredulously at her, but admitted that if she didn't want to miss it, she should keep her hike on the short side. She smiled, nodded, and turned to go.
Oh, and dear?
She looked back over her shoulder.
Yes? Do you still have that iron shoe from the river?
She turned around. Now her brows were furrowed in an unmistakable annoyance. Her eyes flashed, a smoldering dark brown that burned like a tree scorched black by lightning.
Of course I do. Why wouldn't I? You found it. You photographed it. It's all recorded. Why do you still need it? Because I found it. Listen, if the museum wants to buy it, you can have one of your reps contact me here.
She was in the act of pulling a business card from her wallet, but was shocked by the old woman's involuntary gasp. She looked up and saw her crossing her hands over her mouth, as if she had accidentally given away a terrible secret.
No. We wouldn't want it. Just if you change your mind, and you don't want to deal with the TSA when you get ready to board, just consider returning it where you found it. Old things often have bad memories. Sometimes they're best left forgotten.
The professor of early American studies barely swallowed the scowl that darkened her face for a moment.
I suppose,
she said in an attempt to end the awkward conversation.
But sometimes they're best dragged into the light and fresh air.
Returning to her room, she looked down at the horseshoe. It still sat where she had last found it on the nightstand. She picked it up and held it to the afternoon sunlight coming through the transom. She could see the hammer marks where the smith had shaped it, and 2 or 3 shiny gashes indicated where it had struck stones during some centuries-dead gallop of a centuries-dead horse, spurred on by a centuries-dead horseman. It gleamed in the sun, like a crucifix in the light of a stained glass window. She tucked it carefully into her knapsack as she changed into khakis and hiking boots one last time. Chapter 17. Excerpted from Codified Community, Sleepy Hollow's Folkloric Ethos by Madison Gray Kilroy, Ph.D., aged 28. Ghosts, to Irving, represent culture, community, and fellowship, and ghost storytelling operates as a social ritual meant to strengthen and weld communities through their shared narratives. A town which perpetuates its unique legends, then, must be a socially and spiritually healthy place, where bonds and connections continue to be fostered. Ichabod proves to be cocky and vain when in company, but as existentially woeful whenever alone. He loves listening to wild tales by the fire, but dreads the necessitated walk home by himself. Ichabod, by nature a self-seeking, individualistic lone wolf, with no concern for community or fellowship, is forced to confront his vulnerability and uprootedness whenever he's alone. He is forced to realize that he is himself a ghost. His confrontation with the Headless Horseman is a confrontation with reality, a glance into a mirror, a look exchanged with his doppelganger. Like Andre the spy and the mercenary Hessian, Ichabod is yet one more casualty of Sleepy Hollow. A community that kicks back against invaders, users, and opportunists. Andre had sought to subject the community for his king, the Hessian for pay, and Ichabod for his ambitions, and all three are lost into the vortex of Sleepy Hollow's terrible revenge. This is the legend of Sleepy Hollow, the moral that those who take advantage of our hospitality, those outsiders who seek to use and disenfranchise us for their own personal gain without any investment into our community or fellowship, will be promptly evicted, or otherwise destroyed. Chapter 18. Excerpted from the Norwich Packet newspaper, Norwich, Connecticut, 27 September, 1788. Notice: £20 reward. £20 sterling will be offered for any information leading to the apprehension of the notorious Captain Erasmus Craven, late of Mystic Harbor, who so recently became the object of outrage when his pernicious and most infamous ruse was uncovered by the families of Boston town, as the name he lived by was the most diabolical alias. It is unlikely that he may be discovered under it. He is rumored to have left the state by sea and may be fleeing for Philadelphia or Long Island, although a freed slave named Silas reports sighting of a man of his description outside of New Haven, where he was journeying eastwards down the Boston Post Road. He can be easily recognized by his unusual appearance. He is exceedingly tall and lank, over 6 feet in height, and weighs but 10 stone. His hair is of a flaming red color, and he sports large whiskers of the same. His hands and feet are uncommonly large, while his frame and limbs are long and lithe. His head is small and round, with a nose of the Hebrew type. His countenance had been sordidly defaced by the French pox, and is of an unwholesome grey complexion, which is said to resemble that of a toad. He is now believed to have emigrated to New England from Glasgow before the late war, under an unknown name, and is said to speak with a Scotch brogue. He is of a dangerously sly disposition and not at all to be trusted, having made the fool of many honest and virtuous ladies from the very best families of New England, and made cuckolds of their husbands while they were at sea. He is a swindler, thief, and manslaughterer who should be approached with the most serious care, and only by 2 or more men under arms, as his voracious appetite for personal advancement has proven murderous on more than one occasion. Chapter 19. Excerpted from the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. What passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me, must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth, after no very great interval, with an air quite desolate and chapfallen. Could that girl have been playing off of any her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. October 27th, late afternoon. Professor Bracebridge was locking his office up just before he headed home for fall break. He and his wife lived in a quiet country house overlooking the Columbia River, shaded by sleepy pines and sheltered by a rolling ridge woodland. Their daughter and her new husband, 3 older sons and their 3 wives, and a romping troop of 6 wild grandchildren were all due to arrive that evening for a long weekend stay, and he had never been more eager to leave the heat and fumes of the city behind him. Humming as he walked down the deserted hallway, he carried his briefcase in one hand and twirled his keys in the other. Rounding a corner, he smiled at the professor of cultures, societies, and global studies as she locked her office and turned into the hallway. "Good afternoon to you!" She uneasily returned his stentorian greeting with a reedy
"Hello,"
and settled in for what she expected to be an uncomfortable 10 minutes as they walked together towards the parking lot. She resented the unwavering ease that he seemed to experience at all times, and had never engaged him in one-to-one conversation, even though they had shared every workday lunch hour in the same room for the past 3 years. She would have preferred the awkwardness of a searing silence to his chummy small talk, but it was not to be.
"Where are you headed to for break? Staying around here?" No. I'm heading a panel at a conference in Sacramento, so I'm driving down there tomorrow morning."
No rest for the weary.
"Nope. You and Madison, too. The 2 of you are absolute workhorses. You're always on mission."
The professor of culture, societies, and global studies smarted at the use of her colleague's first name. She wondered bitterly if he used her given name when he referred to her too.
"Professor Gray Kilroy has a tough road to hoe." Sure sounds like it. Sounds like she's pretty worried about getting tenure. Serious academics always are.
Professor Bracebridge, a retired farm supplier who had only gotten his master's degree to improve his understanding of his clients' needs, and who now worked as an adjunct for something to do, didn't notice the vitriol in her tone.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
He said lowly, thinking of his colleague's clenched jaw and anxious eyes, as she had described her hopes for publication, and remembered the gossip he had overheard a few months earlier about her parents' deaths and her humiliating divorce. His normally jovial face folded in a worry.
I hope this paper she's working on helps her out. It must be a tremendous burden. It is,
said the professor of Cultures, Societies, and Global Studies with a snakish hiss.
But it's not going to help her a bit. They've already decided next year's assignments. But they're holding it out because if her research is any good, it's going to help the university. But if it helps the university, they'll consider tenure. No, it's all decided. I know because I'm very close to Dr. Washington and Dr. Aziz. And they told me that the department has never considered her as a serious candidate. They're just using tenure as a carrot to get more work out of her. It's all bullshit. Why don't you tell her then? Dr. Aziz told me that in confidence. And don't you tell her. I shouldn't have told you, but you owe it to the rest of us to understand what we go through every damn day.
Bracebridge frowned.
But you have tenure. I didn't always. So what is next for her? Another job somewhere else in May. They'll make the announcements in December, so she'll have to spring to get her CV ready. You're not worried about her? It's not my fault. It's the system. But you can't give her advice or advocate for her with Fatima. Dr. Aziz doesn't need me to meddle with her department. Besides, it's all settled. She never stood a chance. Her research is outdated and reflexive. Reflexive? Reflexive. She isn't talking about anything new or useful. Just rehashing the same tired old tropes, perpetuating the worship of useless old things and backwards dead men. But isn't that part of what anthropology does? Dust and bones.
She muttered under her breath, half in response to his question, and half as a curse in his direction. They were in the parking lot now, and the sun was setting coolly over the campus, spreading its long red fingers up into a bank of strange purple clouds. He made a parting farewell to his colleague, the professor of Cultures, Societies, and Global Studies, as she veered off into the maze of cars, only nodding jerkily in reply. Bracebridge stared off into the shifting mist overhead and thought for a long while. He felt strangely eager to return to his family and to hug his daughter as soon as she walked through the door and fold her tightly to his chest. Chapter 20. Halloween. Late in the afternoon, just before dusk. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees of a tenderer kind had been nipped by the frost into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals from the neighboring stubble field. The professor of early American studies made her way through the old burial ground, looking at the rust-colored headstones as she passed them with caution. Lingering eyes, as if she feared the opinions of the dust and bones buried under them. Here were the graves of Katerina Van Tassel and Eleanor Van Tassel. The former had granted her name to Irving's flirtatious heroine, while the latter had lent him her bewitching looks, fighting spirit, and cunning guile. There was the grave of Brom Martling, town blacksmith, Revolutionary War hero, and wild-hearted daredevil. The small pumpkin was perched on top of his small headstone, a local October tradition, identifying Irving's model for the sham horseman. Names like Van Ripper Acker, Van Eyck, Paulding, Van Wart, and Phillips peered at her from the brown-stained stones, watching and wondering if she understood. And there, again, in an otherwise unremarkable patch of grass, was the black metal plaque with the words Hessian Soldier gleaming across its face in gold lettering. She stood over it for longer than she could remember, mulling over the idea that only a few feet of dirt stood between her and him. In her mind's eye, she could see him flying across the rolling countryside on a dapple-gray charger, under a golden full moon as deep purple clouds scudded across the sky. The landscape on either side of him is a blur, stones flying, sparks flashing with every bound. He's wearing a forest green jacket with dark cherry red facings and caramel-colored buckskin breeches. The yellow moon glints on the scabbard of the saber clattering at his side. His tight, black boots shine as he spurs the horse on, leaning over its flaunting mane with both hands twisted into the reins. Then the road bends and wood appears, swallowing them into its black open mouth. She realized that she hadn't noticed whether the rider had a head or not. Didn't seem to be important anymore. As she moved across the burial ground, she looked up the Dutch church, which was slumbering in the sunlight like an old tomcat, grayed by years of hard work, content with spending the rest of its life asleep, until that day that he passes into an even greater rest. Its peaked windows glowed rosily in the late afternoon light, and its steeple, like a blue witch's hat, rose watchfully over the town. As porches began issuing forth trick-or-treaters and a centuries-old ritual once again moved invisibly in the atmosphere. Overhead the moon was faintly stamped into the blue sky like a silver coin, and the wind was brushing restlessly in the trees. She followed the path down the western bank of the Pocantico until it arrived on the wooden bridge under the swaying canopy of creaking ash trees and maples. She crossed the span and eased down the riverbank until she was standing amongst the massive boulders and fallen trees. Looking up, she felt the woodlands stretching over her like watchful parents. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill moaned sweetly to the silence around them. She followed the riverbank south, tracking along the edge of Douglas Park. The valley was aromatic with the musk of falling leaves, wet stones, and cool soil, and as she climbed over one black trunk and on top of a flinty hulk of stone, from here she could see both sides of the riverbank with the hills rising over them. She felt at home with the dreaming earth around her. She closed her eyes and drank the sensations in with greedy pleasure. It flowed warmly through her like a golden brandy, opening up her nostrils and pouring into each vein and capillary, feeding them with new life. The sound of an explosion shook her from her fancies. When she opened her eyes, the light was still blue and bright behind her to the north, but in front of her everything was shaded by a plummy violet murk, as if she was peering through some strange purple goggles. What was she looking at? A strange bridge she had never seen before, perhaps 50 yards downstream from her perch. It was assembled from mismatched planks of different widths, scraps from the Terrytown dockyard, laid across two massive beams that rested in stone footings sunk deep in the moss and mud. A crude rail fence had been cobbled together on either side of it, out of old ship spars, and the whole structure seemed to sag in quiet mystery. In the darkness, she could faintly see the structure had two men on it, one limping to the eastern bank, and one not moving at all. Suddenly there was a yellow gush of light, followed immediately by a snap, bang, then three more in close order: snap, snap, bang, bang, snap, bang. The flashes were coming from a mud wall high on top of the ridge on the western bank, not far from the church. A cluster of men in a patchwork of brown, gray, and blue uniforms were firing at a party of riders sweeping around the bend of the old Albany Post Road and making fast for the bridge. She could barely see through the dusk and distance, but the yellow glare of another brief flash illuminated the blistered face of a tall, cadaverous man in a red stocking cap, and she shuddered. He was doing something to a kind of wand, with rope twisted around it, blowing on the end of the rope, and here it glowed red as he blew. Meanwhile, the other men were wheeling something forward to a beveled gap between two of the posts, holding the mud embankment together. She couldn't see that they were moving, but they seemed careful and nervous wheeling it forward. The horsemen tore around the corner as musket balls flew at them from across the river, thumping heavily into the earth and trees. Some wore green coats with red trim, others wore red coats with green trim, but they were all carrying light curved swords, and the man at their head was one of the former. As they rounded the turn, his cocked hat was blown off, revealing a head of curly black hair. They clambered onto the wooden planks with a sound like thunder. Watching carefully, the tall man behind the mud wall pressed his smoldering wand to something behind the mud wall. Before the sound of the explosion could reach her ears, its light whitened everything around her, and the scenery transmuted back into a peaceful autumn afternoon, with orange fingers of sunlight pointing to the part of the river where the bridge in her vision had been. Nothing was there now, except a looming blackened oak on the western bank, near where she had seen the mud embankment, raising its two shattered arms in horror.
Chilling tales for dark nights.